Nothing that happens to us is our fault. Generational trauma refers to the transmission of unresolved, emotional, psychological pain from one generation to the next.
Joining us today is Sefami, a renowned trauma psychotherapist from Los Angeles who specializes in decoding the emotional pain we inherit. She blends deep psychology, body-based healing, and even psychedelics to help people break cycles that go back generations.
If you imagine the traumatic event as like a stone that drops into water, you can see that the ripples are just going to keep going out. There is a way in which there are fields of awareness where information and emotion can get transmitted, where it just doesn't seem that direct.
So I want to ask a very pivotal question. Can we really heal from generational trauma?
It's never too late to start healing these wounds. And the healing that parents do always benefits their children.
People who take stress negatively, they tend to have a lot of physical ailments around it, and people who take stress positively actually live longer, or that stress does not seem to impact them physically.
Someone freezes every time they have to negotiate a raise. They never are able to put themselves in a position to negotiate well. And we'd wonder well, where does this come from?
If I am going through some sort of discomfort, how do I identify whether it is me or whether it is something I'm carrying?
What if your anxiety, fear, or perfectionism isn't even yours? In this episode, we uncover the haunting truth behind generational trauma.
I want to be part of this discussion. If you're enjoying Decoding with Jaslin, please consider subscribing to the channel. It makes a huge difference in helping us to bring you the kind of guests that you would like to see. We would also love to hear your opinions in terms of the topics and content you would be interested. So please drop in your comments to share your feedback. Thank you for giving us your time. Welcome to Decoding with Jaslin. Today we are delving into a topic that resonates deeply within me and hopefully with all of you as well, generational trauma. And to help us navigate this complex landscape, I'm absolutely thrilled to introduce our esteemed guest. Joining us today is May Anna Sefami. She is a licensed psychotherapist based in Los Angeles, California, and she specializes in the profound work of treating trauma, including complex PTSD and dissociative disorders. Her approach is truly integrative, blending psychodynamic depth with somatic and experiential methods to foster deep healing. May has not only presented on the fascinating intersection of trauma theory and psychodynamic psychotherapy, but also explored the burgeoning role of psychedelics in the treatment of PTSD. Beyond her private practice, May is passionately committed to advancing nuanced, integrative models of trauma care that beautifully honor both scientific insight and the intricate tapestry of human complexity. May, welcome to Decoding with Jaslin. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that very kind introduction. I'm super happy to be here. I love this topic, so yeah, I'm excited to talk about this with you today.
Great. So let's just jump right in, right? So
Awesome.
for somebody who's never heard the term, who doesn't know what is it, how would you explain it to them?
So I think the simplest way to explain it is that generational trauma refers to the transmission of unresolved, emotional, psychological pain from one generation to the next. So it could, it originates with traumatic experiences. So this could be war, displacement, poverty, systemic oppression, or just the normal tragic things that happen, like a death in the family or an abortion, or it has to do with something that is not processed in the moment. The generation that experiences it is unable to get through it, and then it gets passed on. And so the way that how it gets passed down through families this is so complex, and I want to go into a lot of the details, but I think the best way to put it is through stories, behaviors, the silences that we grow up with in our families, emotional absences, unspoken rules. It's a lot of unconscious learning, right? Like the emotional learning that we get from our parents and from our families. So it can end up showing up in belief systems too, what you think about the world. Is the world safe? Is the world unsafe? And how you're inheriting this from your family. I think one other metaphor I want to give, just because it's visual and it helps this make sense, is if you imagine the traumatic event as like a stone that drops into water, you can see that the ripples are just going to keep going out. So if something happens to one person and they're like, let's say somebody has to go to war and they develop PTSD and they don't have the resources to get through it in their lifetime, it might not just affect their wife and children, it could also affect their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren, and sort of continually until someone is able to metabolize and work through this ripple of pain. So that's what I would say about generational trauma.
And when you say it gets transmitted or it gets passed through the silences, through the things that are unspoken rules and things like that within the family, would you also say there is also the genetic factor involved, or
Yes, the epigenetics. There's a whole field of research on how our genetic code basically gets activated or deactivated depending on stresses. So there's a lot of research about the Holocaust that showed how the children of Holocaust survivors had different stress responses. But there was another whole body of research that was done in New York City around 9/11 when the Twin Towers fell, because some great researchers saw this as a good opportunity and were like, well, let's look at all the pregnant women in New York and see how are their children affected. And what they found is that kind of depending on the stage in pregnancy, children had different stress responses. So some of these children had much lower cortisol levels than you would naturally think, which is actually correlated with like a worse immune response and a worse stress response. So there's a very clear connection between what happens in previous generations and what you're inheriting. This is not always a bad thing, in the sense that it's not so simple. It's like, well, if your grandparents lived through wars and you're inheriting a kind of greater startle response or something like that, if you live in a dangerous place, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It means that you basically are like, you're hardwired to know how to respond to certain things in a better way. So that was one thing I was reading about, and when I was preparing for this, I was like, yeah, you can't just see it as a negative. There's learning there too.
right? And are there any common misconceptions or myths people have around generational trauma that you can clarify or you have noticed?
So I don't know if the idea is broad enough culturally for there to be big misconceptions. Because one thing I want to say is that this idea of generational trauma there's other terms that are used. So collective trauma, historical trauma, ancestral trauma, like a lot of terms are used to kind of describe the same thing depending on the angle that you're coming at. So I don't think there's huge misconceptions. I think the one thing I would say that might be a misconception is the tendency, and this might just be something that's common in my culture, like where I'm living right now, is to think of everything as a form of generational trauma, and not kind of looking at like, well, maybe I didn't inherit this. Maybe this has, more to do with a personality factor that's really something about me, or something like that. And then the other thing I would say is that thinking of generational trauma as just located in families, like going through families, misses the fact that these are huge cultural patterns. And like, let's say there's a war or a genocide or a famine, you're going to have generational trauma at the level of like a whole country or a whole population. And so it relates to these much larger patterns that are beyond the family. So I think I would say that.
Got it. I think in terms of generational trauma, right, like you said, it can manifest in different ways. And you also said sometimes people misinterpret something as generational trauma. So those are all, I think, interesting nuances I want to get into, right? So I'm thinking maybe we can sort of pick categories of various facets of our lives, and then walk me through how in each of those you could have an impact of generational trauma, right? So probably start with the most basic one, which is your emotional and psychological needs, maybe anxiety, things like that, right? How does that sort of, how have you seen it sort of coming? Can you give me with some examples?
Yes, I can. One thing I wanted to say before I answer that is just that I just had this thought as you were talking, that I want to say that trauma is not always remembered explicitly. Like this is like, it's somatic, it's in the body. So this is not always something that, and we're going to get into this right now, but it's not always something that you're going to be obviously aware of. Like, oh, I know I have generational trauma. Like it can live in your body. It can live in these kind of hidden ways, which we're about to get into. I think that the most important premise here is that humans are completely relational beings, right? Like when we're born, we are completely helpless and completely dependent, utterly. And so our entire programming, like our emotional programming, is something that's happening through relationship, like how we're being related to. And if there, and this is true to some extent in pretty much all families, but obviously there's a huge variation. There's usually some feelings, some expression, some action, some element of a child's natural aliveness that their parents will find very difficult or hard to accept and will like turn away from, be like, oh, that makes me anxious. You know, when my baby's mad, maybe I wasn't allowed to, maybe anger wasn't acceptable in my family. And so when my baby or my child is expressing anger, I feel anxious because when I expressed anger, my parents turned away from me, right? So basically what happens is that's an unresolved emotional conflict that someone can carry forward generationally, right? Anger, me feeling anger means that the people I need the most in the world might turn away from me and kind of disconnect in some way. And so whenever I feel anger, now I'm going to feel anxious instead. Like I'm going to squish it down and I'm just going to feel really anxious. If this was, because life is reasonably frustrating most of the time, right? There's lots of reasons for us to be frustrated. If anger is not a feeling that you can tolerate at all, like then you're probably going to have an anxiety disorder. Like that's what that might result in. And so I think that's a really basic example. I want to give some other ones though. Here's an interesting one, like a sense of unease, like someone, I want to talk about diffuse things that don't fully make sense. Like let's say someone doesn't feel like they know themselves, or they feel just like a kind of uncomfortable, like, who am I? What do I want? Like, I feel confused about myself. That's a very important indicator of generational trauma or family trauma, in the sense that it usually means the person hasn't had close relationships in their life where someone was mirroring them and someone was fully seeing them and saying, like, I see you, I understand you, I want to connect with you. And if you haven't had that, it can lead to this inner confusion kind of about who you are. That would be a case where it's like there was a disconnect in your family for whatever reason. Somewhere along the line, emotional intimacy and actually being really close and connected to other people got shut down through pain, through trauma, through something. I could be more, I mean, I think PTSD is a good example. It causes people to withdraw and shut down, right? Sometimes even to protect their children. Like, let's say, you know, somebody comes back from a war and has really bad PTSD, they might pull away because they don't want to share the pain, but then the child is left feeling like, where's my parent? And then just for a third example, I would say that there's other reasons for anxiety, like not just stuck feelings. Sometimes it can be like, let's say you had a grandmother that had to flee some sort of danger or violence or something. And if this fear was never spoken about, it could get passed down through like body language and the implicit ways that people are responding to life around you. So very implicit, very embodied, not spoken, but something that's just in the air. And then this adult might feel like they just have a fear of life, but without a clear cause. They're like, well, I don't know, nothing's bad's ever happened to me, but I just feel like life's not safe. Because I grew up in a family where that was kind of the belief. Like people were, you know, feeling like, oh, people are out to get you, even though maybe there's no evidence of it in that generation. So yeah, I think I'll stop
Interesting.
there. Yeah.
No, those are very interesting examples, and I think that's something people, I think in some form, everybody experiences some version of it,
Yeah.
unexplained emotions or unexplained unease of some sort, right? So I think those are examples I think that could resonate with a lot of people. I think the next facet that I want to get into are behavioral patterns or coping mechanisms, right? For example, in our culture, I do know that people do not, I don't know if it's a belief system or if it's a generational thing, like healthy boundaries, right? Lack of boundaries for that matter.
Mm.
There are also people who you would see that have a tendency of self-sabotaging and things like that, right?
Yeah.
So can you give some ways that behavioral patterns where it could be you versus, say, a result of generational trauma and some examples around it? And even
Yeah.
how how have you seen these sort of manifesting and maybe even how do you sort of handle these situations typically?
Sure. So, for a few examples, I would say that not having boundaries is a really common one. And that's usually because there weren't boundaries in your family, or there was a parent that maybe needed you to meet their emotional needs, or there was the expectation of like the child is going to give to the parent and is going to regulate them and something like that. This can, a sort of example of this might be like, let's say a daughter is constantly managing her mom's moods and organizing the family events, and she feels guilty if she's relaxing because she feels like she has to be the kind of like a compulsive caretaker or someone that has too much responsibility. And so the behavior that then continues in adulthood is taking on other people's emotions, needs, other people's problems, and maybe at the cost of your own well-being, right? Like maybe it's hurting her to do this. But then you go back generationally, it's like, well, maybe her grandmother was a child caregiver during a really hard time and was like praised for holding the family together. And then that becomes a value in the family, unspoken, like, oh, we hold the family together, or like it's the daughter's job to be the one that holds things, that is caretaking everybody else. In terms of how to deal with that, it's kind of a similar pathway for all of this, which is that first of all, you have to become aware of it. Like you have to see what's happening and be able to make full contact with the painful feelings of it, right? Like, because when you're a kid, you can't necessarily be aware, like, oh, I have a caretaking role and this is painful. Like, no child is gonna usually have a lot of consciousness for that. It's when you're older, when you're like, ooh, like actually there was a price that I paid for that, and I don't want to pay that price anymore. Like I want to be able to have my own needs and relax and receive. And I know we're going to get into healing later, but I just wanted to say that's kind of the general principle. And then for some other examples, I would say avoidance of conflict is a really common one. So like avoiding conflict, avoiding emotional expression. So this is, in families where emotional honesty is considered dangerous, where it's like we don't really tell the truth about how we feel, right? Emotional honesty is a little bit taboo. There's a common saying, at least in the United States, that really speaks to this, which is that if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. That's like a really common one, which is like, oh, so you don't want to hear how the person actually feels. So that can lead to someone having this behavior of people pleasing and avoiding hard conversations and suppressing their emotions. And the damage from that is huge, in the sense that it's hard to have authentic, close relationships. It's hard to function in your career. It's kind of hard to do anything if you can't have like normal conflict, like not even bad conflict, just like normal, like, hey, I disagree with you. So that's a big one. Another one I would say is, as a behavior, would be like control, over control, and perfectionism. So needing to have every detail be perfect and really fearing failure very intensely. Let's say someone grew up in a family that was really chaotic and the trauma was unpredictable, and there can be a whole culture where control becomes safety and perfection, it feels like protection, right? Like it's if I'm perfect, if I can control things, then I'm going to be safe. Yeah, I think that's what I would say about behaviors. I mean, the other thing I would say, you had mentioned when we were talking earlier about substance abuse or emotional eating or some of these more like substance related behaviors, that can be a result of any generational trauma, right? It just depends on someone's personality, whether or not they turn to substances to regulate their emotions, because everything I'm mentioning here is an attempt to regulate emotion, right? Like caretaking, you're trying to regulate your anxiety. If you're avoiding conflict, you're trying to regulate the feelings that come up with conflict. If you're controlling and being a perfectionist, you're also trying to regulate your fear of what could happen if you're not. And so another way to regulate feelings other than particular behavior, like psychological behaviors, is drugs or alcohol or food or something like that. So these are all ways to try and like self-regulate.
Understood. I think that's a very interesting way to put it, right? Like that often that this comes up is how you're trying to self-regulate yourself
Yeah.
through sort of impacting others in some manner, whether
Yeah.
it might be trying to control everything or
Mm-hmm.
not having honest conversations or avoiding conflict and things like that.
Well,
And
can I say one thing about that? So one of the main schools of therapy that I'm trained in has a very elegant way of talking about this. They call it the triangle of conflict. So on the very bottom of it's actually an upside down triangle. On the bottom of the triangle is feelings. So this is core feelings: anger, sadness, love, grief, fear. And then over on this corner is anxiety, and on the other corner is defense. And so the idea is that you're usually in one of these three places. So the person who's really wants to over control things, let's say she's not able to control things. Well, now she gets really anxious, right? But underneath the anxiety might be an intense sadness. She's afraid of a loss, and it's bringing up sadness. So she's like, oh, I'm going to control things because I don't want to feel this sadness. Does that make sense? So it's kind of like you're either defending against a feeling, you're feeling a feeling, or you're having anxiety about a feeling.
no, it makes a lot of sense because at least I have seen it creep up even in my own small ways, right? And I think, for example, I know people who like to avoid conflict, and there's no reason for that. It's just it's a very inherent thing in them that they want to avoid conflict, right? I think
Right.
we all know a lot of people who
Mm-hmm.
have that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's I guess that this is one of a very common example where it might be a generational thing because often we don't know this, right?
Mm-hmm.
For example, and you spoke about controlling and navigating and all of that, right? And I think that's very well put. Like for example, my dad was in the army, right? He was a defense officer, and recently, for example, there was a very close India Pakistan war
Yeah.
scenario.
Mm-hmm.
And while everybody around me was rooting for the country and all of that, but the idea of war, because I've seen my dad through war, makes me very anxious, right? And
Yeah.
now my dad is
Yeah.
retired and he's at home and he's safe. But the whole
Right.
just idea of it, makes me very anxious. And so I wouldn't
Yes.
watch so much news around it.
Yeah.
I would just keep myself a bit at bay, like, okay, I don't want to know too
Yeah.
much. Okay, as long as I know the key things, I'm fine, but that's about it. And even when people would talk about it, it would sort of impact me, and I would either say, okay, can we skip this topic? Or I would be like, okay, I don't want to be part of this discussion. And it's not generational, but it's still like two generations or whatever,
Yeah.
just like you said, from childhood, because I've seen my dad go for a war and I've seen people around losing their parents or losing their
Yeah.
husbands to the war. And obviously that as a kid makes you very anxious that,
Yeah.
is your father going to come back or not or whatever. And
Yeah.
that sort of, I saw it play out so vividly recently because I didn't know that like I'm so much older now, and like I
Mm-hmm.
said, my dad is safe and he's at home, but
Mm-hmm.
still it's subconsciously creeping into me. And and because somebody was
Yeah.
telling me you should speak to somebody or you should speak to your dad on the podcast and talk about it, and I was like, no, I
Yeah.
don't want to talk about it. I
Right.
don't want
Right.
to get into it. I don't
Yeah.
want to discuss it. So
Yeah.
I think those
Right.
are
You're
very.
trying to regulate yourself.
Yes, exactly. I
Yeah.
think when you
Yeah.
said that, that's where it made sense. It's coming from a place of fear of, as a child, of losing your parent, which is
Yes.
now
Yeah.
getting, like, as an adult, as an anxiety, and I'm then feeling for others who are
Yeah.
basically maybe losing out. And I remember having this discussion with some people, like some of my close people as well, and people were like, yeah, it's good, and all of that. And I was like, it's good for somebody who's sitting here, but it's not good for somebody who is out there, or somebody's,
Yeah.
when your father or when your spouse goes, it's
Yeah.
not that great a feeling.
Well,
And
and
that,
also, well, I just wanted to
yeah,
say
go ahead.
there's so many feelings there, right? When you were talking about this fear of losing my dad as a child, that's not just fear, that's grief, that's anger. It's
Yeah,
so unfair. Why is he gone? That it's like
yeah,
there could even be guilt, like why am I angry? Maybe this is noble what my dad's doing, and then so it's fear, sadness. Like you have like a whole huge number of emotions that can get stirred up around something.
yeah.
Yeah.
Correct. And I remember once before also there was just talk, and I just remember, and this was like around 10 years back, right? And I remember people were just talking that, yeah, it would be good, we should react and all of that. And I remember I
Mm-hmm.
was sitting and working, and it was in a work environment. And I remember I just had tears rolling down, and I just told these guys that, just stop talking about it, or talk
Yeah.
about it when I'm not
Yeah.
there. And I
Yeah.
remember thinking, it's so funny, right? Like, it's just something that's not there anymore, existing
Mm-hmm.
in my life as a real fear, but
Mm-hmm.
it is something that has crept into my life because of something I experienced as a child, and is sort
Yes.
of
Yeah.
manifesting even now, even though it's been decades after that,
Well,
really.
and this is something I think we'll get to, but that makes me think of how one of the biggest ways in which people come across these ancestral burdens is through contemporary triggers, right? And it's something that's happening in real time right now, and it comes out of nowhere, and you're like, whoa, why did I just get so activated about that? And sadly, but also kind of beautifully, probably the biggest trigger for that is having children, and your children getting to the age that you were at, like when you felt an impact of something or when something happened. So that's universally very activating for parents. Like when, having children brings up everything, and the reason I said it's beautiful is because, like, yeah, that's your opportunity to heal. Now there's this huge motivation, like, oh my God, I love my kids. I don't want them to have to deal with my anxiety. So anyways, we'll get into that, but I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, and that's one of the
Yeah.
reasons I chose this topic as well, because I also, as a mother, have been trying to understand that, right? What is me versus what I am carrying through,
Yeah.
and hopefully try to not
Mm-hmm.
pass on much of that to my daughter.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's like you said, I think it is one of those moments where you sort of start analyzing everything that you are doing,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
because you
Yeah.
also want to make sure that you're the best example for your kid. But then
Mm-hmm.
there are times when you're not logical. Why you're not logical, right? So
Yeah.
those are the areas where you start thinking. Interesting.
Yeah.
So we spoke about emotional
Mm-hmm.
and psychological part of it. We also spoke about behavioral patterns,
Mm-hmm.
right? If I now go into the next facet of, say, physical manifestations,
Mm-hmm.
right? Can generational trauma impact physically?
Yes, absolutely, 100%. I'll say a few things about this. One is that there's this entire field that I'm fascinated by. It's called psychoneuroimmunology. And it's it's right there in the name: psychology, neurology, immunology. So how do our thoughts and feelings affect our immune systems? Neurology, like the psychology and how it's happening neurologically, how does that ripple down into our immune reactions? And there's a huge connection. I think it's a little too in the weeds to go fully into it, but I want to recommend this book by Dr. Gabor Mate, who's a pretty famous physician who writes and talks a lot about trauma. It's called When the Body Says No, and he documents the connection between repressed emotions and physical illness. So there's really amazing evidence that repressing particularly negative emotions, so anger, sadness, is horrible for our immune systems and leads to different types of chronic illnesses. There was actually this research that showed that that, you know, there's often this idea like if somebody gets cancer or something that they should have a positive attitude, like, oh, like keep up your spirits, like be hopeful, when actually the research shows that the people who have negative reactions to a cancer diagnosis, they feel incredibly angry. This is so unfair. Why is this happening to me? Like if they're able to have an anger and grief and all of this stuff, that their survival rates are actually better if that's their emotional reaction, so that it doesn't like help your immune system to keep things bottled inside. So that's a very meta point kind of on the question. As a much more detailed example, that's a very trippy example. There is this book that's called It Didn't Start With You. And it's actually one of the only, there's really not that many books out there that directly address this topic, and that's one of them, where it's entirely about generational trauma. And one of the examples, the author is Mark Wallen, one of the examples he gives, which stunned me, was a patient that came in. This was a 19-year-old man who had been very successful, very fine in his life, and all of a sudden he had severe insomnia to the point that he like couldn't sleep at all. And every night he would also feel freezing, like freezing cold, which was a weird sort of thing. And through their therapy, they ended up discovering this story that this kid's great uncle had died as a 19-year-old and had frozen to death. He was working on power lines and he had frozen to death. And so it was this kid didn't actually know the story. He didn't know that his uncle had died. It had been hidden in his family. The grief had been so intense. It was like something we never speak of type of thing. Like, we're not even going to talk about that uncle. And so this gets into what I consider to be the like metaphysically trippy side of generational trauma, where how did that get passed on, right? Like, how do you make sense of that, in the sense that it doesn't, and discovering this story did really help with the insomnia. Like, once he could make the narrative link of like, oh my God, like there's someone in my family that at 19 years old froze to death and died, like, and now all of a sudden I'm freezing every night and I can't sleep. And I think, oh yeah, and then also to make it even a little weirder, but also amazing, part of the story was that his uncle had tried to stay awake in order not to die, right? Because if you're freezing, if you're dying of hypothermia, it's like, well, you need to stay awake. You need to not fall asleep. And so this is one of the stories, and there are other stories like this. I've actually seen some in my own practice, where the generational trauma, just, you don't know how it got transmitted because there's no materialist way to make sense of it. And yet somehow something got passed down. So that, I wanted to offer that because I find those examples really a little bit eerie, but kind of amazing. I'm like, okay, I don't know how to make sense of that, but that's fascinating. And then here's another example, just to ground in like psychosomatic illnesses. There's something called somatization, where emotions can get pushed into the body, right? So instead of feeling anxious, we might have physical pain or like heart palpitations, or instead of, these are also called functional neurological disorders. So like someone might have a seizure disorder, but you know, they go in and the doctors are like, these are pseudo seizures. Like, they look like seizures, but there's like nothing really happening in your brain that says that this is a seizure disorder, which is actually kind of a common thing. And maybe that's because someone's having anger they can't express. I know I've used the word anger a lot, but I will say I think that's the hardest emotion for people to process. It's one of the hardest ones for people to accept and process, because people tend to feel very guilty about their anger, in the sense that, like, if you're angry towards your mom, it's like, okay, but I also love you. Like, you're also so important to me. And so it can create a real conflict inside people, which keeps it stuck in all these different ways. Yeah, I think that's what I would say about the way that it can show up in our body.
I have so many questions around that example.
Okay. Yeah,
that
yeah.
that 19-year-old.
Uh-huh.
How do you so like you said, you cannot really make sense of it, right? You can't put logic to it, right?
Mm-mm.
So
Mm-mm.
how do you actually know that this is the reason? Because of the very fact that you can't put logic to
Yeah.
it. Though
Yeah,
there
yeah.
is eerie similarity, of course, but
Yeah.
it also seems a bit for somebody who's skeptical and who comes to a therapist, and
Yeah, yeah,
suppose
yeah.
I come and say that I'm a skeptical person, and I come and say that I'm insomnia and I have been freezing every night. And then somehow we speak, and then you say it's because my uncle has frozen to death. I could also take it as hogwash, as they could not figure out. So they just told me
Totally.
that it's because of, right? How do you sort
Yeah.
of
I would
put that
say
story
that,
together?
yeah, I would say that in that case, that story wouldn't work therapeutically. Right? Like if the person was skeptical, if it didn't feel meaningful to them, like, oh my God, it makes so much sense. Like if they didn't have some big like energetic resonance with the story that they had discovered. And here's the thing, in that case, I don't think it would be the therapist telling the client that. I think it would be the client saying, "Oh, I discovered this." Do you see what I'm saying? Like it's like, because I mean, even if
Right.
the therapist was kind of like asking, like, what happened in your family? Like, do you know of any traumas? It's the client that would have to say, "Oh, I asked my mom, and then I heard about this uncle." So, like, if it didn't feel resonant to the client, you're going to have to find a different way to heal. But the other thing I'll say is that these examples are common enough that I would say psychotherapists and people that are really involved in sort of like the healing arts and the healing world in general, it does tend to make you less skeptical because you see enough examples that there can come to be a sense, and I don't mean this in any kind of like really concrete way, but there can come to be this belief that like there is a collective unconscious, or there is a way in which there are like fields of awareness where information and emotion can get transmitted, where it just doesn't seem that direct, but there still is some kind of transmission. And so I know that can sound a little out there to someone that's super skeptical, but I think the way that you lose your skepticism and become more open to that idea is through coming across examples like that, right? Where someone has that experience and then they say, "Oh, I discovered this history." And just the fact of discovering the history like resolves the symptoms in some big way. They're like, "Oh, I'm sleeping so much better." Like, "Wow, I feel like," and then you're like, "Whoa, like what just happened?" As a therapist, you kind of have to like look at it and be like, "That's wild. Like that's amazing that worked." So you tend to become less skeptical as you like see things play out, if that makes sense.
It does, it does. So there's this book called Outliers, right? So one of
Yeah.
the chapters it speaks about is not necessarily in the trauma standpoint, but in terms of how generational traits get passed down. And there's this really cool example I felt of rice paddy fields in a lot of Asian countries, and how those people, even though they have now stopped the rice paddy fields, but to cultivate rice paddy fields is a very hard working work. Like, you need to
Yes.
work very hard. You need to toil every day
Yeah,
to
year
do
round.
that year round.
Yeah, yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, you don't really get to take a break. And you can see that culturally, even today, the
Yes.
people from those regions are typically like that.
Yeah,
They prefer that, right? As a culture, those countries
yeah,
almost celebrate that, and it's sort of coming, which seems very
yeah,
weird in terms of connected, like seriously, like rice paddy
yeah,
fields to the tech world, but apparently it
yeah.
does. And when you look at it, yes, all of these cultures that they had rice paddy fields and sort of coming together, it does make a lot of sense, because they then don't have the other, like, don't like turning off, because they suddenly feel like they're not working, and that's
Right,
sort of
right.
generationally passed on.
Yeah,
I
it
think
creates a work ethic culture where
correct,
there's
exactly.
no expectation of, let's say your crop was corn or wheat where it grows all summer and you don't really do anything. So you don't have an expectation of like, oh, summers we hang out. Like summers
Yeah,
we're not
correct.
working, which is the cultural expectation for people that were farming corn or wheat or something
I mean,
different.
that it's
Yeah.
it's it's really beautiful. I think it's bringing up so many thoughts, even in me. Like, I'm from a place where it's a small state. So in India, it's called Kerala. So it's a very tiny state, and
Mm-hmm.
typically, at least in my side, people in Kerala, they have only certain amount of, say, land or crop or whatever. So most people end up going for jobs or figuring out some sort of jobs, like in today's world, right? Like either working for somebody or starting something of your own or something like that, right? And I had this weird cultural you know, cultures sort of coming together when I married my husband, who's from a place called Chikmagalur. And so it's like a very huge place. Probably not like compared to the US. I think in the US it's the same huge is whatever, but it's huge in terms of India, huge, and like everybody over there owns estates or coffee estates. So that's the thing over there. Most people own coffee estates. And so, even culturally, right? Like, for example, I see the difference between my husband and me in terms of work or how we approach work and things like that, right? And it's sort of, I remember he would say, oh, I just at some point want to retire and chill and just, take care. And I would be like, what would you do after retirement? Like, I don't know what to do after retirement, right? Because I see my father or my family members' retirement and they don't know what to do. They're just chilling the whole day.
Yeah.
And now that I've seen that family and this family and culturally how they are, I sort of now get to realize that aspect of, yeah, I mean, coffee is not a plantation that you need to be toiling all year round. There are
Yeah.
a couple of months of off time, like around summer typically. So you do have that a little bit of that kind of mindset. And it's also not as crazy that you have to, when you have that land, it sort of inherently gives you that confidence that, yeah, it's going to be fine. But when you're coming from a place of you have to figure out your daily earnings, you have to figure out to take care of your family, then you get generationally passed on that, no, how can I just chill or how can I not do something? I have to do something. I have to bring money home, right? Even though it's not required in today's maybe generation, but I think it's sort of generationally come through.
Can I give an example related to that? It's a little bit of it's kind of a heavy, sad example, but it's profound in the sense that it like shows this really well. It was, God, I really wish I could remember what book this is from, but I read it so long ago that I don't remember the title. But it was this story of how in Black American communities, mothers will often there can be a culture of if someone praises your son, kind of dismissing it, being like, oh, he's a handful, like he's a lot of trouble. Even if this is like the least troublesome kid ever, there sort of is this like culture of reflexively trying to deflect praise from your child. Like, no, like they're not that special. And what the book said is that, so this can be hard for sons because they're like picking up this message of like, oh, I'm trouble. But when you look at it generationally, this is so sad. The generational trauma is that if you're an enslaved Black American, you don't want someone to think that your son like great or like hardworking or something. Like basically it would create a danger for your child. Like if someone was like, oh, your kid is like so like awesome, like I'm gonna sell them or use them in this way. So you would want to deflect attention away from your children. So basically it was a form of love. It was like, I love my child, so I want to make sure they don't get attention. And then this gets passed down as sort of a cultural habit of like, I need to deflect positive attention away from my child because that's a danger to them. Now, obviously, this is not going to be true for everyone. This is just what this book said. But it was this example that really, it hits your heart where you're like, whoa, that makes so much sense. And that's also so sad. And you can really see how a generational trauma plays out in that way.
Yeah, I mean, now I'm again thinking, right? Because in India, you have, especially for kids, people get very there's this whole concept of evil eye, right? People get very skeptical if you take your kid out and people are praising your kid, and then if you come back and the kid sneezes or has a cough or just falls sick, and then you immediately are like, oh, this is because of all the evil eye. Again, I don't know if this has got anything to do with the generational trauma, but now I'm intrigued when you said this, that is there any part of the culture that sort of, because it's a common theme
Totally.
in our country.
Yeah, I want it. There's so many things I want to say. I'm afraid it's going to take us off course, so I'm going to hold myself back. But like, yes, it's an interesting phenomena that's in many places. Like, oh, like don't praise my kid publicly. Like that's not
Yeah, I'm gonna
that's
go research, go
yeah,
check out
yeah,
about it for sure.
yeah.
Okay, so now
Yeah,
I
yeah.
want to get into the next aspect of,
Okay.
say, relationships, right? People, there is some sort of innateness that comes out when you become a partner, especially, right?
Hmm.
You become a husband, you become a wife. There is
Yeah,
something that you carry on, which I think everybody who's married or everybody who's been in a relationship knows that
yeah,
there are parts
yeah,
of you which come out which are not entirely you, which,
yeah,
you yourself
yeah,
can't make sense of.
yeah.
So I think that's something that I really want to get into. Like, how have you seen generational trauma affecting this?
Yeah, so this is a big one, maybe one of the biggest. So remember I said earlier that humans are completely wired for connection, utterly and completely, right? We're born helpless. Our primary relationships wire our nervous system. So here's kind of a fun way to think about this is that as a living system, right? A complex, nonlinear living system, a human baby, their brain starts out completely open to experience, right? They're ready to receive any kind of experience. Now, what happens is that as their caregivers are relating to them, the brain actually starts to there starts to be constraints on the system, right? Instead of being completely open, now there's expectations. It's like, oh, this is what connection feels like. So constraint sounds like a negative word, but it's not, because think about it this way. Like, let's say the baby gets really, really good caretaking, really love, safety, joy, delight. It's great. So now the brain has created a constraint that says relationship feels like I'm paid attention to, I'm respected, I'm loved, people delight in me, and that's how reality works. So you've built a constraint that's awesome, where it's like, what this means is that this child will then grow up and they will choose partners that fit that template. They're going to be attracted to and they're going to resonate with people that respect them, delight in them, pay attention to them, and so on and so forth. So obviously, it's usually mixed for most of us, in the sense that there's some good constraints and there's some hard ones, in that we're wired to look for people that feel like family. And so I just want to say that, like, first of all, we are going to resonate with people that feel like family already. They already fit into our family template. And so what this means then is that people tend to choose, the templates tend to kind of match in both a positive sense and a negative sense. And that the really good stuff might come out in the relationship, like, oh, we connect in this way that is like the most positive version of our families, right? There's some like synastry here. But then also, people will choose a partner where it's like, oh, we mutually avoid conflict because we both come from families where that wasn't a good thing. And maybe that's fine for the first couple years of a relationship, but very quickly it becomes not fine, because actually we don't agree on everything. And actually we need to have some healthy conflict. And so what can happen in relationships is that people will tend to activate each other's core wounds, and this can start cycles of conflict that really are related to generational impacts. So, this is such a common example. Let's say if people are in a disagreement, one person tends to pull away and avoid, like they kind of want to be alone, or they tend to disengage because that was the best way they could adapt as a child in their own family. And the other person has a core wound of feeling abandoned and terrified, like that, like abandonment is their core wound. And so then their partner pulls away and it triggers that feeling of abandonment. And now their reaction is to like move closer or to cling on or to try and engage more, like, why are you pulling away? And now you've triggered the other person's maybe core wound of enmeshment, or feeling like there's no boundaries, or like I don't have any space. And so this becomes it's like a figure eight pattern, where until two people can become conscious of what they're carrying, like I tend to feel abandoned, and then I get really scared that, you don't fully love me, or you're going to leave me or something. And the other person's like, I tend to feel overwhelmed, and I feel like there's no room for me, and I don't get to be a person because it's all about how you feel. Until someone can consciously like say that and notice it as it's happening, it continues. So there really is this process of needing to know, what are you carrying from your family and how is it getting activated with another person? Because that's when you can start to do something different. And I do work with couples, so this is like a lot of the work I do with couples, is in these moments of conflict, someone being able to have enough awareness to say, like, hey, I feel like you're pulling away because you feel like, I'm coming on too strong, and right now you're having that anxiety response, and I'm starting to feel really abandoned. Let's take a 10-minute breather, but then let's make an agreement to come back to this conversation. So they start to regulate through awareness, or through being able to say the healing thing. Like, hey, I want to give you space and I really respect your feelings. I'm not trying to overwhelm you. The other person could say, I'm not going to abandon you. I'm still here. I love you. I just need 10 minutes to feel like I have some space. So it's where you can start to see it and then make different choices, that you start to build more trust when couples are stuck in that tug of war. But the tug of war that can happen is almost always related to family wounds that are not healed. They're not conscious, they're not healed, and they're coming up between two people. I can give
No,
another
I
example. That was a big one though. So if you wanted to
go
say
ahead.
anything.
Go ahead. No,
Okay.
no, no, go ahead.
So a few other examples. One would be someone being like a peacemaker in relationships. So just classic, not being easygoing, not saying what they need. They never start arguments. They're low maintenance. They feel invisible or disconnected. And so let's say this would be an example of someone that grew up in a household where expressing their needs led to punishment or tension or something. And if we even want to take this further, we could say well, let's say a grandparent who survived a war then taught the family that the value is survival over self-expression, right? So to keep the unconscious learning is that you have to keep the peace or you're going to lose love. You're going to lose love and connection unless you keep everything calm, everything peaceful, everything okay. So that could be, an example of a generational trauma that someone bringing into a relationship. And I think this is an example we already talked about earlier, but it applies here. Someone who in their relationship feels like they need to caretake and fix everything, but then feels resentful of everyone, right? So they're I'm the one that everyone leans on, in my friendships, at work, with my partner. But underneath, that person might feel angry, no one's ever asking how I'm doing. And if we want to connect that to a generational trauma, this could be someone who grew up being responsible for a sick parent. And maybe they had to be. Maybe this was their parent really was ill and they needed the care. But that child might learn that love means fixing something. You have to fix things, you have to help in order to be loved. So now his relationships are going to be based on earning care and not feeling like you can just receive it freely, right? So that's a kind of a role-based thing that can happen in relationships and could be related to a generational trauma.
Yeah, I think anybody listening, if he or she has been in a relationship, would definitely, I think, resonate with some portions of it.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
I think, I mean, we all carry our parents or our generation before us, especially in relationships
Yeah.
when there is when you are in a relationship, you will have situations when you're uneasy, when there's conflict, when there is something which you may not agree to fully. And how do you navigate that often comes through some sort of pre-built mechanism. And I guess this really explains that, right?
Yeah.
The next part I want to go into is ambition or finance and all of that, right? There are people who naturally sort of almost look down on wanting to be rich or wanting money. And there are people who call themselves that, oh, I'm a spendthrift. There are people who are also on the other spectrum who are misers, who do not want to save, spend money. Even if they
Yeah.
have a lot, they don't. Are
Yeah.
these also common generational traits or trauma traits that are sort of carried on?
Yes, yeah, very much so. There's actually a really good book on this. It's called The Cure for Money Madness. It has a kind of clickbaity title, I think, The Cure for Money Madness. But it's great. It's a great book. It's by this guy Spencer Sherman. It came out a while ago, and I was looking into it in preparation to have this conversation with you because it's not something I've thought about that much, the financial stuff. This book gave me a lot of really good ways to think about it. So I'll give a couple examples. One would be, let's say someone's afraid of asking for what they're worth. So someone who is not, it's not that they don't want to succeed, it's that they don't know how to express ambition and like earn what they're worth. So let's say someone like freezes every time they have to negotiate a raise. Like they never are able to put themselves in a position to negotiate well. And we'd wonder like, well, where does this come from? Let's say this is a man who watched his father avoid conflicts around money, right? Wouldn't discuss finances, wouldn't ask for help with any money stuff. And basically money was just like a we don't talk about it topic. And so this person would internalize the idea that asking or talking about money is somehow dangerous. Like there's something feels very anxious to me about this. And they might not even know why. They would just get in this place where it's like, okay, now I feel really anxious when I have to do this thing where now I'm talking about money. In terms of being a spendthrift or a miser, like you said, I'm immediately thinking of the Great Depression in the United States, just because it's such a common thing, at least for people of my generation, to have a grandparent that may have lived through the Great Depression and then seeing how they handle money, right? Where they're very, very careful with money. But also, behaviors like buying extra flashlights and extra socks and being really, really prepared for something. But it can create this tendency of like, I need to have a really big nest egg because I don't feel safe unless I do. But some other examples would be, so here's an example. Let's say someone the theme would be like avoiding money to avoid pain. So the person might be, let's say it's a freelancer who doesn't do well with they delay invoices and tax deadlines pass and they're not checking their bank statements. And so every time he's sitting down to deal with money, he gets really physically anxious. And this might be someone where rather than their family not talking about money, maybe he comes from a family where money was a huge source of conflict. So his parents would fight about money all the time, very publicly, and he had to deal with that, hearing about these huge conflicts about finances. And so what that creates is an association between money and shame and loss. There's shame here, something bad's gonna happen. Maybe the family didn't have enough money, so there's that shame of feeling like, oh, we're poor, we're fighting about money. And so this person might be very smart and able to be successful, but they're self-sabotaging financially because every time they have to deal with their finances, they're just feeling intense pain and anxiety of shame and loss. So yeah, that's another example. And I got all these examples from that book, or sort of from the principles of that book. And I recommend it to anyone who has real issues with money and wants to understand, where does this come from? Why am I struggling so much?
Okay. Now, going into the last facet, which you mentioned, is typically one of the most common places where generational trauma opens up is when you become a parent or when you have a kid.
Yeah.
How does this sort of creep into that?
And I think in every possible way it comes into it. So parents usually will follow what their parents did or try and do better and correct it. Either be really unconscious and not even think about it, or think about it a lot and be like, oh, I don't want to do what my mom did. So oftentimes that's great, but sometimes it goes too far, right? So if you were raised in an authoritarian household, you might raise your children in a very permissive way, almost too permissive, and this might be a reaction to your own experience. So I'm speaking in generalizations, but that's kind of a ripple of how generational patterns can lead to different types of parenting. So in terms of, connecting with your children and parenting your children, you have to deal with a lot of feelings, right? Kids have really big feelings. Their brains are not developed, and so much of parenting is regulating your child, helping them feel calm and safe and good as they are facing life, which they don't have the skills to do that calmly. They're going to have big reactions. They're going to be sad. They're going to be mad. They're going to be tired. And so that in order for a parent to do that with equanimity and presence and calmness, the parent has to be able to basically be comfortable with whatever their kid throws at them. Like, it's like, okay, this level of sadness, this level of anger. And what I think for almost everybody, there are areas where something in your child is going to cause anxiety in you. And then the question is, well, what do I do with that? What do I do with the anxiety? Because if someone's not conscious of the anxiety, they're not aware of it, they might just defend against it. For instance, like, let's say sadness makes them feel really anxious. So their kid's really sad because, let's say sadness makes them feel anxious because in their own family, it was considered weak, right? It was inappropriate. It was weak to express sadness. So then their own child is sad and they might be consoling their child in a way that's pretty anxious. They're bringing potentially a lot of anxiety to the interaction. And I think that's the type of thing where then this kid is taking on, they're gonna grow up with anxiety about their own sadness because it wasn't accepted with their parent. Does that make sense? Like, it's like if it couldn't
Yeah,
be
yeah.
held with the parent, then you're sort of passing on the trauma of like, oh, we can't deal with sadness in this family. So, and then this is something I already said, and I do think this is one of the biggest ways in which generational trauma becomes obvious, is if your child reaches an age where you experienced a trauma, if you haven't like fully resolved that trauma, it's going to come up almost inevitably. Like it will be the biggest trigger ever. Like, oh, let's say your mom died when you were 6 years old. Your daughter turned 6. That's going to be a thing that comes up psychologically and spiritually and emotionally, just through that resonance of being around a little being that you love that's exactly the same age you were when you had to go through something. So yeah, I think that's something just for all parents to be aware of, that it's normal and it's okay when things come up, especially on those like age markers. But it's kind of just a motivation to then look at what might be unresolved in yourself.
Very, very deep and interesting. Now that we went through all these various facets, right? If I am going through some sort of discomfort, right? If I'm having anxiety, if anything, right? How do I sort of identify whether it is me or whether it is something I'm carrying?
This is, we talked about this a little bit earlier, and it's such a tough question because it's almost always both, right? Like, it's almost always like, okay, you learned and were programmed some way by your family, but also maybe you just had a major conflict at work and you're anxious because it's reasonable to be anxious, right? Like, something just happened that would reasonably make you anxious. Like, in the sense that hardship is part of life. I mean, think of breakups and heartbreak. Like, that's not generational trauma. It's just that our hearts get broken in life. Like, that's something that happens to humans. So in terms of identifying whether or not you're really like carrying something where it's like, this isn't mine, I haven't really experienced a trauma that would like make me hold this, there's this good process. It's from this system of therapy called internal family systems, and they call it, when they talk about generational trauma, they talk about legacy burdens. Like, that's the way that they refer to it. And everything that I kind of thought about and researched on this topic led me to the same conclusion, that the most important way to distinguish is to sit with whatever the thing is and self-reflect and write about it, and basically come to this subjective feeling of, does this feel like this is really mine? And this is something that you can kind of feel in your body, where it's like, is this mine? Like, does this belong to me? Or is this something I have taken on? Now, if it's something you've taken on, your mother's grief, your father's anxiety about money, then there's the opportunity to give it back. Like, that's the point where you can kind of differentiate from it and be like, okay, I'm actually going to give this back to you. It's not mine to hold. And when I say give it back, that's a psychological, energetic, spiritual decision. Like, that doesn't even have to be a conversation. It's more about are you willing, now that you're fully aware that you've taken on this thing, are you able to kind of give it up? And I would recommend that if listeners are interested in this, to do some research on internal family systems and this idea of legacy burdens. There's a lot of really good YouTube videos and content that can help kind of walk people through these steps. So I just want to recommend that.
Makes sense, I think. Yeah, just sitting with yourself, understanding and self-reflection. Now, once you sort of identify these, right? What do you do about it? Now, not everybody can go for therapy or might be willing to go for therapy. So, are there some things, some actionable ways, anybody who's listening and who realizes that, yes, these are some things or some pain or some characteristics that I've been carrying and it's not mine? How can I learn to cope with them in small ways without a therapist? Is that possible?
Yeah, so it's always possible. I think the general principle here that's important is that energy that was frozen in pain will start to move again when you heal. So this is about moving energy, right? There's a lot of ways to move energy. Psychotherapy is one of them, but there's a lot of other ones. Like deep journaling is a really, maybe, when I thought about this, I was like, I think that like long form writing is one of the most powerful ways to kind of access your own mind if you're just getting started with like, what is here, how do I feel about it, what does it all mean, like writing things out. But there's another, because there are so many different ways to engage in self-healing, I want to introduce this concept of wayfinding. It's one of my favorite words ever. Wayfinding originally refers to how the Polynesians would navigate from island to island. So how they would use like the stars and the winds and the currents and the birds. They would be watching all these things. They didn't have any instruments, but they navigated really well through to like very distant islands in the Pacific. And so metaphorically, for our purposes, wayfinding refers to like navigating your way through uncertainty using subtle cues. So it's rather than like a set map or a predetermined plan. It's like, how do you sense what is the next right thing for me? Like, do I need to be engaging in meditation every morning? Do I need to be journaling? Do I need to be calling my friends more because I tend to distance myself and I need to like be, I've noticed that that's a pattern. I'd like to be closer in my relationships. So there really isn't a one size fits all. It's about like tuning in to yourself and figuring out what do I need to do that's specific to me. The other thing I want to say that is generally applicable is just the principle of making space and making time for it. So if you have this goal to understand difficulty you're having, whether or not that's like specifically generational trauma related or something else, you have to make time for it. You have to set aside, this is the time where I'm going to meditate, I'm going to write, I'm going to call my friend, I'm going to do Tai Chi, like whatever it is. You have to make space and prioritize. So I know that's a little broad, but I think that is just a very important principle.
So, if I would just take away one habit from there, which probably everybody can use, you would say that would be journaling, right?
Yeah, I would say journaling, because as long as it's long form, like you're actually writing, there's a lot of research that it's very different what happens when you're typing versus when you're writing. And
What
it's
happens?
your memory and your like memory networks and your brain and your learning centers, you don't learn as much when you're typing. You can't remember. Like, here's an example. If you take notes by hand, apparently people can remember like 40% of their notes, whereas if they type them, they only remember 10%. And this sort of gets at to, we are very tactile beings, and having to write something out with a pen and paper, it slows us down, for one. Most of us can type much faster than we can write. And it brings this self-reflective quality to what we're doing, which can also be there when you're typing, but there tends to be more research in favor of handwriting versus typing if you're trying to introspect and have deep insights about your own mind and figure out what's going on inside yourself. The other practice I would say, and this isn't necessarily, I guess the other one, I didn't mention this before, would be gratitude practices. It can sound a little bit like frivolous or something, but the research behind it is really, really strong, that gratitude practices are incredible for our mental health. And it can be one of those things where even if you're in the hardest circumstances, it can be like, I'm grateful there are beautiful flowers on the side of the road. I'm grateful for anything that is bringing, it kind of tilts your mind towards beauty, towards abundance, towards what's going well, which can be hard to see when you're having a hard time. So that's another practice I would recommend.
Yeah, I think I was reading this research about people who have stress and how, the body reacts to it. And people who take stress negatively, they tend to have a lot of physical ailments around it. And there are people who
Yeah.
take stress positively, right? Like, oh, this is so
Right.
cool. I'm getting excited about it. That's why. And they then actually live longer, or that stress does not seem to impact them physically, right? And while it's technically the same thing that's happening for both, it's just your perception towards it that's changing.
Totally.
So I'm sure, like you said, I think gratitude might be something very useful. You mentioned a couple of books throughout our conversation. So if there was one book that you would recommend to anyone who wants to get onto this self-discovery journey, which would that be?
Well, that's fun. Okay, that's a little hard for me because the book I want to recommend has not come out yet. It comes out in December 2025. It's really exciting, though. It's called Releasing Our Burdens, A Guide to Healing Individual, Ancestral, and Collective Trauma. And it's by two of the kind of the biggest names in this, which would be Dick Schwartz or Richard Schwartz, who came up with internal family systems, and then Thomas Hübl, who's this wonderful German kind of mystic psychotherapist who writes about collective trauma. And the two of them got together and they co-authored this book. So that hasn't come out yet. It's coming out in December 2025. It seems like it might be one of the better ones because of who the authors are. But in terms of books that are out right now, I'm going to give two. I can't give one. I'm going to give two. One is Healing Collective Trauma by Thomas Hübl. That's for people who have a real interest in the kind of like larger picture of this. And then I'll recommend No Bad Parts by Richard Schwartz, which is about internal family systems. And it does include this idea of legacy burdens, that you can be carrying things which are not yours and that there are processes to give them back. And every single process that from different authors and different traditions that talks about giving back these burdens, it always is an imaginal process. Like you're seeing it in your mind, you're visualizing it, like what does it look like? Are you like handing over the energy? Like how does it happen? And there's so much power in that, like visualizing giving back an energy or a burden. So I just wanted to add that there tends to be consensus that like you need to see it and feel it and have an experiential, energetic process by which you make this decision to give something back.
Right. So we spoke about how to heal ourselves. What are the situations where you think trying to heal by yourself may not really work out and you do need to go for professional help?
Yeah, I think that the key word here might be like overwhelm or stuckness. Like if you feel that you can't manage, you're not managing, like it's becoming too much. You're not in an upward spiral. However slow that upward spiral might be, you feel like you're more in a downward spiral. Like it's like I just can't manage this on my own. That's when you reach out for help. And it's, professional help is ideal, like going to a really good therapist that has specialization and knowledge and deep experience in what you're suffering from. That's the most ideal situation. But reaching out can also be to a trusted person, like a wise older person that maybe not even in your family, but someone that you trust. So I just want to add that humans need each other. And if you can't afford a therapist or you don't have access to that, it's like reaching out to other people in general and asking for help is incredibly important. The other thing I'll say is that, and this is where if you can access and afford therapy, I would recommend it, is that what gets hurt in relationship is always healed in relationship. If you have a deep and long therapeutic relationship with a therapist that is attuned and cares about you and can really have like a genuinely positive, kind, safe relationship with you, it can rewrite your map of who you are and how relationships work in a really positive way. Remember how I was talking about how like babies' brains are getting constrained into like an idea of the world. Another word for this is internal working models. So it's your internal working model of like, how does this all go? And when you're in a deep therapeutic relationship, those models become updated, like they get improved, where it's like, oh, maybe I am lovable and I deserve attention. And oh, now I'm going to be more attracted to people that treat me like I'm valuable and I'm lovable and I deserve attention. I also want to say this process of like updating working models and really healing our sense of ourselves and our sense of life and our sense of relationship can happen outside of therapy. Like sometimes you get lucky and you meet a really kind person and a really loving person and the two of you connect, and people heal each other very naturally in life. But of course there is a value to mental health treatment. I believe a lot in expertise for one, and in therapists learning and getting really good at specific ways of working that address specific things. Not everybody needs the same treatment, and there's so much to be said for really good therapy that addresses your exact issue. So I would say if you're overwhelmed, go see if you can find somebody.
Okay. We are almost coming towards the end. So I want to ask a very pivotal question. Can we really heal from generational trauma?
Yes. Yeah. We can
And
absolutely
what
heal
does it look
from.
like? What are the steps typically that you would see?
Sure. We have to tell the truth. We have to discover the truth. That's one of the biggest principles here, right? Because I mean, what is trauma? It's when things get stuck. The story's not told, the pain's not spoken, it's not felt. Like the full truth of whatever happened has not come into the light of day. It has not been seen. So we have to know the truth. The other thing, and without getting too deeply into like the finer points of psychotherapy, which I do love talking about, I want to keep this broad. Healing, you have to develop inner presence in order to heal. So to be able to stay with your experience, especially uncomfortable experiences, and then attuning to others, right? So being able to listen, being able to have empathy, being able to sit with someone else's distress, being able to find things that are frozen, right? Like find those areas. And a good measure of this is anxiety, right? Like what are the things I'm anxious about? It's like, okay, well, that's the thing that's frozen. That's the thing you don't want to touch, is these feelings that, feel too much. And then I think for people that have been really traumatized, like people that come from very, very, very painful families, I think there's a lot that needs to happen with embracing a spiritual dimension. And this doesn't have to do with like religion or belief. I'm really talking about existential issues of faith in life and a sense of connection to life. Right. And so another thing, and this is more for people, for anybody, but especially people who have had really, really difficult generational trauma burdens, is that you need to restore the body to aliveness. This is a very long and very hard project, but bringing breath and movement or energy practices to like awaken the body, help the body come back to life, which is a scary process for people that have had to shut down in order to feel safe. So yeah, I know that was all kind of general and broad, but I think that all of those points stand. It's just that like each individual person have to wayfind. They really have to like listen in and be like, is the healing thing for me going to be like leaning into these friendships that for some reason I'm avoiding and like having that, just getting better with intimacy, or do I need to talk to my mom and dad and say like, what are all the family stories? And, like, have I never even asked that question? Like maybe I need to start learning about my family, So it's so individual, but yes, we definitely can heal.
That was very profound, I would say. We're closing the conversation now. Just before closing, is there anything that you would like for the listeners to sort of take away?
Yeah, I think that this one thing is that it's never too late to start healing these wounds. Like if there's a listener that's later in their life and feels like, oh, I wish I had done healing work earlier, it's never too late. And the healing that parents do always benefits their children. Even if, you're 80 and your child is 50, any healing you do at 80 will benefit your 50-year-old child. Like the ripples never stop. And similarly, a child that changes and heals, you're in your 30s, your 40s, whatever, and you go into this big process and you start healing and changing, it's going to ripple into your whole family. It will change. It's going to change everybody else. Like there's this way in which nobody can stay the same in a family system if somebody really changes and starts to heal. It puts huge pressure on other people in a super positive way, where it's like, hey, like I have boundaries now, so I'm going to need you to start managing your own feelings a little more. And then it's like, oh God, things are changing, but that's beautiful because the person gets to learn like, oh, like maybe I can take more responsibility for myself or something. I think that's the biggest thing.
That's
It's never too late. There's always hope, and the process is incredibly meaningful. Like it's the most meaningful thing we can do for our relationships is heal ourselves.
that's beautiful, May. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I'm hoping anybody who's listening would do the same as well. It was so great to have you, and I think it's a topic that I really resonate with, because I just think it's something that we take for granted or we don't pay attention to. But
Yeah.
it's the small things where, we can really work on ourselves and actually make the next generation a bit better than what we have been. So thank you so much for your time, May. It was wonderful having you on the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Super fun to talk to you.